Good afternoon to you all. Welcome to the Wilson Center. We are honored to have the Vice President, the Vice President of Brazil, Hamilton Mourão, with us today for his first public event in Washington, D.C. as Vice President. Since joining the government, Vice President Mourão has emerged as a moderating voice in Brasilia and someone who supports civil dialogue, freedom of expression, and the rights of the press inscribed in the Brazilian Constitution. As you all know, providing a forum for non-partisan and open debate on pressing global issues is our core mission here at the Wilson Center. And there are many pressing issues for us to discuss today, from the role of the military in a democracy to the ongoing crisis in Venezuela and Brazil's domestic and political challenges. We look forward to hearing the Vice President's thoughts on these and other topics. We are also pleased to discover that the Vice President has an early connection with Woodrow Wilson. In the early 60s, when his father, an Army officer, served in a military Inter-American Commission in Washington, Vice President Mourão attended the Woodrow Wilson High School right here in Northwest DC for the first semester of his freshman year. After returning to Brazil and completing his secondary education, Vice President Mourão enrolled in the Military Academy of Agulhas Negras. He served in the Brazilian Army as an officer for 45 years, including as military attaché in Venezuela and on a UN peacekeeping mission in Angola, and rose to the rank of 4-star general before retiring in 2018. He's one of the 8 former senior military officers currently serving in the government. As I welcome Ambassador Sérgio Amaral, Fernando Simas, Ambassador Luigi Einaudi, I wanted to express, Mr. Vice President, it is my pleasure to welcome you to the Wilson Center, and please, the floor is yours.
Dear Paulo Sotero, Director of the Brazil Institute of the Wilson Center, through you, I would like to greet the audience attending this event. Ambassador Sérgio Amaral, Ambassador of Brazil to the United States, ladies and gentlemen. The official visit of President Jair Bolsonaro to Washington 3 weeks ago raised expectations on the strengthening of the relations between Brazil and the U.S. In the past couple of days, participating in events in Boston and in Washington, I heard many encouraging comments from politicians, business people, professors, and students. I have been able to see important players turning their eyes and ears toward Brazil with confidence that our country is getting back on the right tracks. On that note, I want to thank Paulo Sotero for organizing this event. I believe that the Brazil Institute, as the only think tank in DC exclusively dedicated to Brazil, has an important role in advancing the understanding about the agenda of reforms presented by our administration and how that agenda will enable our country to reap more benefits from closer cooperation with the United States and other strategic partners. Within 2 days, on April 11th, we will complete 100 days in office. The date will offer an opportunity to take stock on what has been achieved so far, while also allowing us to set the course for the future work. We know that there is still a long way ahead, and our duty will only be accomplished on January the 1st, 2023, when President Bolsonaro and I will hand over power to the next elected government. By then, I'm confident that we will have taken decisive steps to enable Brazil to fulfill its manifest destiny as the largest and most vibrant and prosperous democracy in the Southern Hemisphere. From the outset of our administration, we acknowledge that the Brazilian economy is not in tune with current times and that our public institutions are still very far from the needs and wishes of our people. The global context has been deeply transformed by the economic and political reforms adopted in the late 70s and early 80s. The triumph of the neoliberal ideas, coupled with a scientific and technological revolution, brought to life what has been called globalization. The impact of those reforms were magnified by unprecedented developments on information and communication technologies, resulting in an international environment of greater instability and competition. Today, all nations, even the most developed ones, are kept in a permanent state of alert. The speed of change makes the new look older in a blink of an eye. Conflicts appear everywhere, and transnational threats such as terrorism, cyber war, drug trafficking, epidemics, illegal immigrations, organized crime, environmental and climate catastrophes are all around us. The information society cannot be confined within our national borders. The social networks became part of everybody's life, but those channels and technologies are also used for wrongdoings. The so-called globalization brought efficiency, information, and comfort, but unfortunately, it also allowed hate, intolerance, and violence to spread more easily through our societies, right under the nose of existing institutions. Such flows are faster than our capacity to provide political response, and governments seem to be facing critical challenges everywhere. Even the international trade governance is now under threat, as a commercial war is taking place, and many countries are starting to protect their internal markets. Latin America, in turn, is still searching for itself, trying to break out of its peripheral logic. Our region wants a better place on the great geopolitical chessboard of globalization and global value chains. We are still great exporters of primary goods with very low added value. To make it worse, many countries in the region are still under the influence of colonial dogmas and of people who believe that the Cold War has not ended and defend ideas that went wrong everywhere else. Venezuela is an emblematic example of the destruction that the so-called socialism can do. Late President Chavez conducted a process of conquer of power using the democratic instruments of elections and a new constitution that gave him full control over the state. His death showed that he did not have a substitute, and Mr. Maduro is simply completing the disruption of the country. What of Brazil? This colossus with continental dimensions, incredibly rich, but it seems that it wants to be the eternal country of the future. Due to governments that believe that the state should do everything, we walked into a terrible political, economic, and social crisis. We have been cut down by the incompetence of the political leaders, by the inefficiency of the public administration, and by the cancer of a compulsive corruption. Leftist governments turned their backs to market freedom and opened their arms to embrace crony capitalism. That process was interrupted with the impeachment of President Dilma Rousseff, and most decisively with the election of Jair Bolsonaro as the President of Brazil. Bolsonaro was elected in a wave of indignation and a vigorous movement to rescue our country, our pride, our values. First and foremost, we are committed to restore the confidence in the country and in its institutions, so we can resume the path toward social and economic development. From the outset, our government has taken steps toward a reform of the state. We reduced the number of ministries, appointing a cabinet without political influence, far from the practice that sold the government to the political parties. We've also cut more than 20,000 positions in different levels of the federal government, the so-called commissioned positions, which are open for non-career appointments and therefore were part of the give-and-take game of old politics. To attack the main problems linked to the economy and public security, Mr. Paulo Guedes and Mr. Sérgio Moro were chosen. Both ministers, within their fields of competencies, have already presented legislative proposals to address issues that are critical for the future of our nation. As part of our priorities for the first 100 days, the pension reform and the anti-crime, anti-corruption bills were submitted for consideration of Congress. Several projects were also presented from other sectors of the administration, but we have clarity that the priority now is the pension reform, followed by the anti-crime and anti-corruption package. On the economic side, the two main structural problems of the Brazilian economy are low economic growth and the deterioration of public accounts. Each of these problems are deeply rooted on years of economic mismanagement, and our response will need to combine different measures in order to have lasting impact. For the productivity agenda, we should highlight the tax system reform, the opening of the economy to trade, privatization, and the reform of our educational system. We need to remove the state burden from the back of those who produce. The fiscal consolidation, in turn, will be achieved by a combination of the social security system reform, freezing public sector wages, the reduction of fiscal subsidies, and other measures as the liberation of the mandatory expenditures and non-recurring revenues. On February 20th, President Bolsonaro personally handed over the pension system reform bill to the presidents of the Chamber of Representatives and the Senate in a political gesture that illustrated the priority given to that reform. We are now working to have the pension reform bill approved in Congress, but obtaining the necessary votes is not an easy task. Party fragmentation poses a challenge for any political system, and in Brazil, we have more than 30 political parties represented in the parliament. We were not elected to revert into old politics of corruption, bribery, and co-optation that have caused so much damage to our political institutions. That's why the government has decided to intensify its efforts to persuade congressmen and public opinion that the current social security system is doomed and that a substantial reform is badly needed. The proposal aims to save around $260 billion over the next decade. The draft submitted to Congress is balanced and progressive. It will cut privilege, reduce inequalities, and preserve the future of our children and grandchildren. Important outcomes were already achieved by the Infrastructure Concession Program under the leadership of the Minister of Infrastructure, Tarcísio Freitas. The program includes roads, port terminals, railways, power transmission lines, sanitation infrastructure, among others. Minister Tarcísio announced, after a series of successful auctions, that the government met the goal of delivering 23 concessions before 100 days, an outcome that contributes to promote investment in strategic projects as well as to improve the business environment in Brazil. We also need to get rid of the excess of regulatory requirements and the red tape that keep our country tied, preventing entrepreneurs to flourish and develop. A radical simplification of the process to open a new business is necessary, and the regulatory agencies must be kept free of political influence. On public security, we have to work in 4 different axes. Tighten the legislation so that criminals really spend their time in prison. We have to end the progressive system which only benefits criminals. We have to deal with the problem of crimes perpetrated by minors as well. The prison system has to be changed because prison can't be a place for vacation and from where the criminal lords command their groups. Our police force need modern technological device and support from intelligence, while we also have to ensure greater control over our borders. Finally, public security policy can only be successful if we create jobs, improve education, and offer basic social service for the groups that live in poor and vulnerable situations. The package of bills prepared by Minister Sergio Moro and presented to Congress provides for greater effectiveness in the fighting against corruption, organized crime, and violent offense. Those bills are also a priority for our administration, and even more for the Brazilian people who suffer most directly from the scourge of violence, crime, and corruption. Finally, Mr. Bolsonaro has a firm stance towards the Constitution and our institutions. Everybody can be sure that Brazil will enter into a new period in history, one marked by efficiency, responsibility, and no corruption. The president is a statesman who is not looking at the next elections, but at the next generations. Now, more than ever, Brazil is committed to the same democratic principles and values that have inspired and guided the United States. It's not by chance that President Bolsonaro and Trump had such a fruitful meeting 3 weeks ago. In the conversation I had with Vice President Mike Pence yesterday, I was also convinced that our shared values will pave the way for greater cooperation and integration between the United States and Brazil, resulting in mutual benefits for our countries. We are promoting reforms that will have real and lasting positive impacts on growth, productivity, public security, and many other fields such as health, education, and environment. Brazil is aware of the challenge of our times. We will continue to do our part in global efforts against climate change, as our government is also working to ensure a better future for the next generation. I will return to Brasilia tomorrow, and I will have more confidence that when our mission ends on January 1st, 2023, Bolsonaro and I will have advanced in our most important concern, which is to ensure greater freedom to the Brazilian people, as phrased by Franklin Delano Roosevelt in his speech of the State of the Union in the year of 1940. Freedom of speech, freedom of worship, freedom from want, and freedom from fear. Thank you very much.
Bom, muito obrigado. Thank you very much, Mr. Vice President. We have some friends here that would like to ask you more specific questions. And for that, I would like to invite Ambassador Luigi Einaudi, former Assistant Secretary General of the Organization of American States, to start us off. You can stay. Yes.
Thank you very much, Mr. Vice President.
You're welcome, Ambassador.
Welcome to the Wilson Center, and I hope this is the first of many further dialogues. As a career military officer, sir, who have only recently come into the political sphere, I would be interested in your views of the political role of the military, which under the Brazilian Constitution retains an obligation to guarantee public constitutional institutions. And I'm curious as to what your views are on that and whether those who remain on active duty agree with you.
Thank you very much for the question, Mr. Ambassador. This is something that concerns everybody, okay? Once two people that came from the military were elected in Brazil. Of course, Mr. Bolsonaro, he spent 15 years in the army and 30 years as a politician. He knows how to do politics. Well, I myself, I retired last year, and I was called by Mr. Bolsonaro at the last moment to join his ticket, and here I am. One thing has to be very clear. Our Constitution, in its Article 142, gives the task of our armed force, of course, is to defend our country, to keep the powers, and for any desire of each one of the democratic powers to cooperate with the guarantee of the law and order. And so our armed force, they are only doing this. They are not in the government. Of course, we have some people that came from the armed force in the government. And I think it's normal because once Mr. Bolsonaro came from this group, when he had to choose people with competence and with capacity and who know the activity that they were supposed to run, he chose one of those guys, a series of those guys. So what I want to assure, Mr. Ambassador, very clear, the armed force, they will keep as they are and as they have been in the last 34 years, since the end of the military regime in Brazil in 1985. And we have received the task of the Brazilian people to run the government for the next 40 years and to do our best and our big efforts to change the course of action that Brazil was taking and to restore our economy and to restore the security of our people and to put the country back on its tracks so that we can reach sustainable development. Thank you.
I would now invite Joel Velasco, a dear close friend of this institute. He is now Vice President for United Health for Latin America. Joel.
Good to meet you, Mr. Vice President. And I'm not going to ask about healthcare policy, but I'm actually going to ask you about the Vice Presidency. I had the pleasure of working at the Vice Presidency here in Washington when Vice President Al Gore was serving under President Bill Clinton. One of the things that I learned from that experience serving on the Vice President's staff is successful Vice Presidents are only successful not only in what they do afterwards. In case of Al Gore, he was not successful, but it's really, they're successful. It really has to do with two things. One is their relationship with the president and knowing where his signs are, but the other one is really picking a few things to focus on. I'm curious if you can tell us what are some of the 2 or 3 things that you'll be focusing on, assuming you're going to follow that lead.
Thank you very much. Well, it's not easy to be a vice president. Of course, you're second in command. Okay? And of course, you can look at me, well, you've been a general for 12 years, you commanded everybody. Well, now I don't command. I'm the one to be commanded. Okay, so the first thing is this. You have to have discipline, intellectual discipline to understand the needs of the president. So I look at myself as a complementary man for the president. Things that he doesn't want to speak, can tell me, okay, you go there and you speak. And sometimes I say to many people in the press, well, I feel myself like the shield and the sword of the president. I can defend when he needs to be defended, and I can attack before he needs to attack. That's other point that I see. And, well, I tasked myself and in a straight vision with the president to bring our way of thinking to the different people in our society. To speak with people from investors, from investment, to speak with syndicates, to speak with local leaders, so that we can convince everybody to have confidence on us and believe in us, believe in what we want to do for Brazil. So I say that I'm doing more publicity work for the government, okay? That's the way I'm feeling right now. Our constitution is very vague about the tasks of the vice president. It just says that the vice president exists to substitute temporarily the president and to receive special missions, okay? Whenever the president wants to give me a special mission, I'll be ready.
Thank you. Monica De Boll, professor at the Johns Hopkins University Advanced School of International Relations and also a fellow at the Peterson Institute here in town.
Monica has a fame that precedes her.
Oh, thank you very much. It's a pleasure to meet you, Mr. Vice President, and a pleasure to get to ask you a question. So I will deviate from the subjects that have been raised thus far and just raise a question about the region and what's in Venezuela and the impact on the region. Having you as a very renowned expert on the situation on the ground. So my question basically is, we know that the Venezuelan crisis is having many spillovers across the region, in Colombia most notably, but also in other parts of the region. And I would be very interested in hearing your views about the role that Brazil can play in helping to resolve not just the Venezuelan crisis, but also the spillover effects as a global leader in the region. Thank you.
Thank you, Monica, for your question. Well, what is happening in Venezuela, everybody is following up. It's the chronicle of announced deaths, okay? The way things were being done in that country, we didn't have any doubt that we would reach the point that we are seeing right now. So it competes to all of us in Latin America to help Venezuela. And how can we help Venezuela now? Well, we have to do all that is in our hands to press the Maduro government to call new elections, okay? To get out and, okay, they don't have the capacity to solve what's happening there. The country is shattered economically. The population is suffering because they don't have access to food, they don't have access to medicines. The problem now of the electric power is reached a point of no return because there is no people with capacity to do the maintenance. The maintenance, of course, was not being done, so they don't have electricity now. Yesterday, I had a chat with one fellow from Venezuela, and he told me that her mother-in-law still lives there. She is 82 years old, and she lives in the 12th floor of a block. And her grandsons has to come all the way up with water, with food, so that she can live a normal life. So it's difficult, the situation. What can we do? It's what we are doing through the Group of Lima. We have to apply pressure. The political pressure is being applied since the moment that we did not recognize anymore Maduro as the real government in Venezuela, and we recognized Guaidó. And the economic pressure. Brazil and Colombia can do some part of this economic pressure, but the great pressure comes from US. Yesterday I spoke about this with Mr. Pence, because, okay, you see the great revenue in Venezuela is the oil industry. And where goes the oil from Venezuela? Mainly to the US. It's a heavy oil. Okay, the refineries that you have here in your south coast in Texas, they are specialized to refine the oil, the Venezuelan oil. So as long as we keep this pressure, we tight the regime, I think this will be a moment where Maduro will understand that he has to leave. And then there is the day after. That's a big task, a big responsibility for us and for the Venezuelan armed forces. Because we know there are the Cubans, there are the militias, there are the colectivos, so the Venezuelan armed force have to deal with these guys. And also the international community will have to provide the funds so that we can raise Venezuela again.
I now call Benjamin Young. He is a professor at State University of New York, currently a fellow here at the Wilson Center at the Brazil Institute, an anthropologist.
All right, thank you very much. Mr. Vice President, lesbian, gay, bisexual, and transgender Brazilians are deeply concerned over rising violence against LGBT people, also about the stripping of LGBT protections in government policy, and about the denigrating statements made by President Bolsonaro and other members of the administration. You yourself have recently emerged as a voice of moderation, as when, after gay Congressman Jean Willis of Rio abruptly resigned and fled to Europe out of fears for his life, and you you told the press in response to this that anyone who would threaten a parliamentarian this would be a crime against democracy. Mr. Vice President, how do you address the concerns of LGBT Brazilians, and especially their concerns about their rights, the right to freedom from discrimination that is guaranteed to all Brazilians in the Constitution? How can you reassure those Brazilian citizens? Thank you.
Thank you for your question. Well, President Bolsonaro, he firmly and truly believes that he was elected for everybody who is in Brazil. Okay? So there is no problem, there is no case about minorities. Our government has no policy to, okay, we are going to persecute minorities. That's not the way we behave. Everybody who is Brazilian must stay in Brazil, okay? It must be, like I said, free from fear. They don't have to be fear anything there. And in the specific case of Mr. Willis, I particularly think that he should have stayed in Brazil, okay, and believe in our law and our policy, our police, so that we could protect him. That's the task of the state. I think he should have stayed. Okay? It's very sad when things like this happen. So what I can assure you, there is no policy of the government to persecute who else has. Okay? Brazil is for everybody. And of course the minister who is in charge of the LGBT people, this Minister Damares, she has open channels with them. Currently, I haven't seen problems like this. And of course, violence that happens has to be dealt by the police and by the law. Because I think all you agree with me, a mass democracy, okay, like ours with 200 million people, only can be together, only can be in peace if the law is above everybody. So we have to be by the law, okay?
Thank you very much, sir. From one anthropologist to the other, Steve Schwartzman from the Environmental Defense Fund, an expert on Brazil for more than 40 years. Steve.
Thank you, Paulo, and thank you, Mr. Vice President. You mentioned just now that Brazil will continue to do its part to combat climate change. I very much wish that I could hear a representative of the United States government make a similar declaration. And it's obviously very timely. Even as we speak, in Rio de Janeiro, terrible flooding, at least 6 people have died. And this, only one of an increasing series of events that you characterized as environmental and climatic disasters around the world. Yet, Environment Minister Salles characterizes climate change as an academic question. Do you share this view?
Well, what I think, I have no doubt that the climate is changing. I lived in Rio de Janeiro in many years of my life. I remember some 50 years ago when I was a young boy in Rio, well, we never used the air conditioning. Okay? We slept in the summer without any problem. Today is impossible to sleep in the summer in Rio de Janeiro without air conditioning. So this is a simple proof that there has been a change in climate. What I can think is this change has come to stay, or it's one of the sinusoidal that happens in the life in Earth? It's the only thing that I can argue about this. But there is no question about the change. It's changed. And like you said, in Rio, any rain, it's a big problem by the topography of the city, by the disorganization of the occupation of the city. So we have to deal with this. And of course, and the first there was all that talk about the Paris Agreement. Okay, we are going to stay in Paris Agreement. We have to fulfill the Paris Agreement. And I think that we in Brazil, we can pass a good word to everybody once we do our homework in this in this problem of the sustainability and the environmental question. Also, I look forward because there is going to be a market of carbon credits in the nearby future. Well, we will have a lot of carbon credits to sell. That's my answer.
I would like to pick back on this question because there is something that has intrigued many people here. We know that the Amazon is an asset for Brazil. It's not a liability. And the question is how best to use the Amazon, to mobilize the Amazon in benefit of our economy, of our society, and of our presence internationally. Do you have thoughts on that?
Well, we have a plan for the Amazon area. What happened is most of the Amazon area is not fully integrated to Brazil. For instance, you only reach Manaus by plane or by boat. There is one road that comes from the state of Rondônia that has a big problem, as far as today has not been solved. We need to integrate the Amazon area to the rest of the country. You have to look also that the Amazon area is an empty area. For instance, Amazon is not only in Brazil. Peru, north of Bolivia, Colombia, part of Ecuador, the Guianas, part of Venezuela, they all are in the Amazon area. There is one point that on part of this area that belongs to Brazil, to the Guianas, and to Venezuela that I call the island. And if you imagine, if you come through the mouth of the Amazon River, you reach Manaus, you go up the Black River, and you go north and you reach the border between Venezuela and Colombia, there is a channel, the Cassiquiare Channel, and you go to the Orinoco River and we will go back again to the ocean. This is an empty space. There is very few people in the Brazilian side, very few people in the Guianas, and very few people in Venezuela. We have to deal with all this area, and it belongs to all these countries. We have to keep the forests, and we have to find ways to explore the biodiversity that exists in the forest. Where the arch of fire that the agriculture border reached its foremost point. We detained it, and we have to rebuild part of the forest that was degraded by this exploitation. It reached the southeast part of the state of Pará and the south of the state of Amazonas and part of Rondônia and Acre. We have to deal with this in a good way. And we have to be examples for the rest of the world. And we have to, technology will be very important so that we can explore what we have in the Amazon area and at the same time keep it like it is. Because, okay, she's the lung of the world and we have to keep it this way.
Thank you, sir. The final question goes to Elcior Santana from Georgetown University.
Yeah, Vice President, just a follow-up of your answer right now. You mentioned the Amazon and how to deal with this. Brazil is actually crucial to solve two of the most pressing problems that everybody's projecting for the next 30 or 50 years. One is food and food security, and Brazil is well placed. Apparently, is one of the 5 countries that can respond to that challenge. The second issue is the issue of water scarcity. And this is already behind some conflicts between countries, between regions, and so on and so forth. It tends to be a growing and very difficult problem. So, given that Brazil has 15% of the reserves in the globe of fresh water, what scenarios are you considering in terms of how to deal with this challenge?
Well, it's a very, very challenging one. And in my last periods in the Army, I told my junior officers that we probably in the future would kill and die for water. Maybe future wars will happen because of the lack of water. We have seen people in North Africa launching themselves in the Mediterranean Ocean to Mediterranean Sea to reach the south coast of Europe because they are fleeing from bad climate and total absence of water. Well, it's not easy to deal with this question of water, as we have to think very strong about, and so far we are just planning how to do with this, okay? But we are very concerned, very, very, very concerned. The first part of your question was?
It was about food security.
Food security, yes. Agriculture is the greatest, richest in Brazil. And more than 40 years ago, one of the uncles of my deceased wife, he told me that our future would be the barn of the world. Okay? I think that is our main task. We can provide food to everybody. We have good technology, we have water, we have sun, we have the land, okay? We have to keep the land. We have, for instance, some 2 months ago, I went to Mato Grosso to see the harvest of the soya beans. And so they were cutting the soya beans and over the rest of the harvest, they were already cropping the corn. So it's a technology that's ours. We discovered that. And we can provide also this technology, for instance, for people in Africa that, okay, they are starving sometimes. And, well, the land in the Central Africa is very similar to the one of our Central Brazil. So that's a thing that we can be leaders in the world. Thank you for your question.
Well, with that, the Vice President has other commitments. I would ask you to recognize his presence.